in a recent Q&A that I mentioned something that sparked the interests of some of the members of the channel. And not surprisingly, because what I was talking about was the use of intoxicants in practice. And so what you need to understand is that I'm not encouraging you to do this practice. I'm also not telling you you shouldn't do it, because what you do is up to you. I'm not your teacher. But there are some interesting points that we need to understand regarding this practice. And that's because here in the West, we have an awful lot of misconception. Now, the comment I made on the recent Q&A was that we don't understand this practice. And the example was the use of psilocybin. And specifically, I think I mentioned that those individuals with a very high level of practice are able to practice with even a heroic dose. But for us, not only do we not understand this practice, we don't understand the relevance. For example, when we take a large dose of psilocybin. The fact of the matter is that for somebody with practice, then there is no difference between intoxication and sobriety. But for us, what we see to be important is the strength of the experience, the intensity of the experience. As I said before many times, then all practice is about removing clinging. It's about eliminating clinging and clinging to whatever that might be, whether it is clinging to conceptual notions of existence and non-existence, or clinging to phenomenal appearances. And when we say phenomena, what we're referring to are those things that arise to the sense perceptions. So in general, when we take a large dose of mushrooms, we see the intensity of that sensual experience to be something special. But here's the thing. In terms of the Buddha Dharma, then appearances can neither help nor harm your practice. We miss the point because appearances are not the important thing. The important thing is the natural, stainless, and unchanging nature of mind. That is the same as when we are stone cold sober or when we've taken a large dose of psychedelic drugs. So we, in general, in the West, see this intense psychedelic experience to be something special. And really, this is how we think about all spiritual practice. We're looking for the supernatural. We're looking for something special. Now, is it the case that there is no benefit in taking mushrooms just for the experience? Well, there can be benefit. There can be psychological benefit. But it's very much like taking a painkiller. For example, if I develop a lot of stress in my life, my relationships are falling apart, I'm having trouble at work, and then on a weekend I take 7 grams of mushrooms. When one recovers from this kind of experience, then often what one finds is that we have experienced a reset. It allows us to drop our stress and anxiety, albeit temporarily. But the important thing to understand here is that this is not a long-term solution, and it certainly isn't spiritual practice. I mean, using the drug in this way in order to achieve some kind of reset, or in order to let go of trauma, for example. What happens is, on the basis of our habituation, quickly we fall back into our old negative patterns. And after some time, our stress and our anxiety, our confusion builds up again. Spiritual practice is that which leads to permanent liberation from all suffering. When I say suffering, I don't mean just pain. I mean anxiety. Primarily, the inability to accept whatever arises, whether that be good or bad. Now, if it were the case that LSD or magic mushrooms had some special spiritual power, then logically the more of that substance one took, and the closer one would proceed towards enlightenment. But we know that's not the case. In fact, most of us are well aware that prolonged use of these drugs in large quantities leads to severe psychological problems in the future. And this is something I have a lot of experience in, because for the beginning part of my life, for over 20 years, I was a musician. And so I was continually surrounded by people who were taking drugs. In fact, there is a quite infamous character that I'd come across in my early days. His name is Genesis P-Orridge. At one time, he was the head of a cult in the 80s, and he did a lot of controversial things. One thing he did was use drugs as some sort of spiritual or psychological path for transcendence or personal transformation. And one time, he decided he would take large amounts of ketamine every day for 1 year. I think you have to be either brave or stupid to do this. Now, it is possible that by doing that, you may experience some positive psychological transformation. What's more than likely is that this practice will drive you crazy. And sometime after he did this practice, I met him in a nightclub in New York called CBGB's, where we were playing. And it seemed to me that he had become completely deranged. Now, it may have just been the short-term side effects of having taken ketamine every day for such a long time. I don't know. I didn't spend that much time with him. But from my own experience, what I know is that people who engage in long-term and intense drug use generally develop psychoses. And if you take enough LSD, then you will also more than likely become temporally disoriented. It's where you no longer can differentiate between the past, present, and future. All kinds of strange things happen. It's not a very nice term, but in the past, we used to call these people acid casualties. And I've met a lot in my life. And I think most of us are aware of this, that if we took large doses of psychedelic drugs every day for a long period of time, our minds would become unhinged. So then logically, it's obvious that there is no specific spiritual power associated with psychedelic drugs. These things are appearances. Appearances are mere conditions, or what you could call triggers. And psychedelic experiences can be positive triggers, and they can also be negative triggers. But for a spiritual practitioner, then they do not use intoxicants in this way. They do not use intoxicants because they think the intensity of the experience is something special. As I said, all practice is about removing clinging. And someone who has a very high level of practice has very little clinging. And that means if they take a heroic dose of mushrooms, they also don't cling to those delusionary appearances. Famously, then Trungpa, and he was a known alcoholic, was offered some LSD by his students. And when he took it, he laughed and he said, "You guys are just living in an illusion in an illusion." And that's because our mundane life is seen to be illusionary and dreamlike. And then on top of that, when we take intoxicants, we only fall further into our delusion. But it's not like that for an experienced spiritual practitioner, because for them, they don't cling to these experiences. There was another funny story that I'd heard, and in the past, then there was a split between Akong Rinpoche and Trungpa. They together, they started Samiling in Scotland. At some point, Trungpa went to the States. And so he had his own students. They were all associated with Shambhala, and Akong Rinpoche had his students who were associated with Samiling. And at some point, Akong Rinpoche and Trungpa students had got together. And Trungpa students were all kind of like hippie types from America, and they were generally getting up to all kinds of mischief and doing all kinds of weird things. And so at this time, when Akong Rinpoche and Trungpa students were together, the Shambhala people, Trungpa students, thought they would play a trick on Akko Rinpoche. And so they baked some cookies and they said, "Oh, Rinpoche, we've made some nice cakes or cookies, please have some." And with the usual gusto, then Akko Rinpoche ate them all up. But what they didn't tell him was that these were space cakes, and they were really strong apparently. I mean, I wasn't there. This is a story I heard. And Trungpa students followed Akko Rinpoche around all day long. And to their amazement, they never detected any change whatsoever in his behavior. The space cakes didn't seem to have affected Akko Rinpoche's normal way of being in any way whatsoever. And Akko Rinpoche is someone who, when he was around, used alcohol on the path. And it's quite common in the Tibetan tradition to do this. Of course, if you're somebody who's a recovering alcoholic, you wouldn't dare do such a thing. But if you are a good meditator, then it can be quite beneficial. Because in general what happens is, when people drink alcohol, they lose control. And this is why it is generally avoided in the Buddha Dharma. It's one of the main precepts in general. However, in Tibet, then many practitioners use alcohol. But it's not because they just like getting drunk. The whole point is that the reason why intoxicants are forbidden on the spiritual path is because they cause one to lose control of their mind. And the whole point of our practice is to remain present. In fact, this was debated at the time of the Buddha, because people knew that it was the intoxicating effect of alcohol which was to be avoided. So the question was raised, if one drinks alcohol but doesn't get intoxicated, is it still a sin? So when these yogis in Tibet practice with alcohol, they don't practice to get drunk. They practice to test their ability to remain present in the nature of mind. In fact, there is a story associated with the Vinaya. There was a monk who had an enemy. This woman was trying to bring him down, and she thought of any way she could in order to cause him to lose his vows. And so one day she approached the monk and she said, "If you don't break one of your vows, then I'm going to kill myself." And of course, the monk thought this was absolutely horrific. He thought, it wouldn't be good for me to murder someone, or to tell a spiritual lie. Also, to steal or engage in sexual misconduct wouldn't be appropriate. But if I broke this ancillary vow, the vow not to drink alcohol, that itself wouldn't be too harmful. And so he had a drink. And as the story goes, then the monk got so drunk that on the base of that, he lost all of his other vows. So it's a kind of silly story, right? But it shows us the point of this vow of not drinking. It's because we don't want to lose control. And so practitioners who have a very stable mind, and especially those practitioners who have recognized the essential nature of reality, for them, the use of intoxicants in their practice can be a very powerful way of increasing their realization and experience on the path. Unfortunately, that's not what happens for us. If we get intoxicated, if we get off our head on LSD, then we no longer have any control over our mind and we only engage in negativity. So I think what I said in the recent question and answer was that maybe if you took a small dose of psilocybin, it wouldn't be too bad, especially if you use that as a basis for your practice. And in general, although I'm sure that many Buddhists wouldn't agree, I don't think there's much harm in things like microdosing, where people take very small amounts of psilocybin or other intoxicants in order to change their mood. In fact, we do this all the time. We take all kinds of medication that changes our mood. And in general, this is seen to be okay. But as I said, I'm not encouraging you to do this practice. And not only that, I'm not telling you you're not allowed to. It's not my place to tell you what to do. I, for one, in my past, have experienced taking psychedelic drugs In fact, I've taken just about every drug imaginable. And when I discuss this topic of using intoxicants on the path, then unlike most of the monastic teachers you will find, I am talking from a position of experience. And for the most part, our Tibetan teachers who are brought up in monasteries themselves have never experienced this. So it's difficult for them to talk from a position of authority on the matter. In general, they consider that you should avoid all intoxicants. And I agree that in general, this is the best path for most Westerners. We live in a permissive society, and one cannot say that this has necessarily been a positive thing. The important point here is that you must develop strength in your practice. And furthermore, that the act of getting intoxicated itself has no significant value in terms of the spiritual path. Whether or not this will be productive in your own practice very much has to do with your own level of clinging and the strength of your meditation. My advice is that you spend a lot of time in your shamatha meditation and develop mental stability. And also you do everything you can to rid yourself of your mundane addictions. And once you get to a point where you're more or less free from your negative emotions, then, and only then, it's time to start considering taking intoxicants onto the path. Well, that's about all I wanted to say on this topic. Some of you may have noticed that I'm still posting videos of me wearing monastic robes, and I did mention this in a previous video. The reason is there's a lot of previously recorded material. Much of it comes from the spring retreat at KDOL on Mount Tuam in Salt Spring Island. So for the meantime, you will see videos of me wearing monastic robes. But in terms of my plans, then essentially nothing has changed. My intention is to do whatever I can to help those who sincerely aspire to make progress on the spiritual path, to achieve liberation from suffering in the mundane world, and eventually the state of a fully enlightened Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. So until next time, then see you later.